Good morning everyone, my name is Damien, thank you for watching my video. Liking and subscribing is a wonderful thing I have heard, so if you can that'd be great. Today I'm going to talk about the books that I read during July. I read 8 books, which is pretty good. Not great, not terrible, but about where I thought I would end up. I like to read 12 if I can, but that is ridiculous, particularly if they are long books. So let's go through them and see what they are all about. So the first one here is, and I've got a little system set up now, it's Cesar Aira's The Literary Conference. So I made another video about that, which I will leave below, which will have a link to the video down there. You can hear all about it. I talk at length about this particular book. So I won't go into much detail now, other than to say you should 100% read it. It is tremendous and amazing. Next book I read, or this is actually going in order, so the Cesar Aira book was the last book I read for July, and we're going progressively back through to the start of the month, which is going to be really weird when I show off a trilogy, so I might do that in the reverse order. At any rate, this is Last Evenings on Earth by Roberto Bolaño. He is a writer who is exceptionally dear to my heart. I admire him kind of more than any other writer who has ever lived or will ever live at this stage of my life. He is definitely in my pantheon of the 5 or 10 great writers who helped shape who I am as a reader and who I would like to be as a writer. This is a collection of short stories. Generally speaking, they deal with young literature-sick people who are passionate about writing, passionate about reading, and get into various adventures. It's a very strong collection of short stories, and it's translated by an Australian guy who lives in Newcastle, I think, so that is something. Okay, so the next 3 books all are trilogy, and they're a science fiction trilogy. I don't normally do science fiction, or trilogies I suppose, but here we are, and it is Julian May's trilogy, The Galactic Milieu, and this is the first book called Jack the Bodiless. So this book, for me, was a book that I read excessively when I was a teenager, sort of maybe 14 to 15, maybe 16, and I would get it out from the library and read this particular book over and over and over and over again, and the library didn't have the second or third book, so for many years I was obsessed with this particular book and had no idea what happened, no idea about the mysteries and the murders and all that sort of carry on for quite some time. After a little while they got the second book, and by a little while I mean years later, and that was okay. I never really loved the second book the way I loved the first book. And then the third book, I think I found at a second-hand store in my 20s and read it, and by that stage I was well out of the realm of science fiction, I suppose, which included fantasy for me at the time as a teenage boy. But it was nice to see the end of it. So I was sick earlier this month, and I read this entire trilogy. So Jack the Bodiless is an odd title, and what it is about is it's about 50 or 60 years in the future, and Earth has been welcomed into the Galactic Milieu, which is 5 or 6 races of aliens who have brain powers, metapsychic powers. They're called operants. And the humans around the world have those kind of powers as well, and more of them are getting them, and it's all very interesting. The vast majority of the time, these mind powers are used for telepathy, so talking to one another with your mind, and that's fine. They don't really do much else with them. They can do like levitating things with their mind, which is all very fun and well, but that's not what you're supposed to do. That's looked on as very a bit naff. They can do things like, I don't know, melt stone to make steps out of it, but again, you're not really supposed to do that. So it's basically a fancy way of saying they can talk to each other telepathically, which is fine, but it doesn't really show off just how amazing mind powers could be, I guess. At any rate, the 2 sort of plot points of the story, the reason for it existing is, 1, the humans entering into the Galactic Milieu and having troubles with that, and 2, a kind of metapsychic horror creature called Fury, who has created some evil little beasts called Hydra, who are out to kind of, I don't know, destroy the galaxy or something. So it's all very, it's a bit violent, it's tinged with strange sexual things, which as a teenage boy is fairly interesting to read about, I suppose. But for me, the thing that really connected with me was that there's a character in this book called Mark, M-A-R-C, and he's part of the big Remillard family, who are the main characters of the story, basically. And Mark was 14 in this book, I think, which was about my age when I started reading it, so I saw a lot of myself in Mark because Mark was arrogant and intelligent and had mind powers, of which I possess all three of those things, or at least the arrogance part when I was 14 anyway. And I enjoyed reading about his antics because he was smarter than everybody else and a bit of a grump, which honestly at 14 is a rather attractive feature. Jack the Bodiless is his brother, Jack, or John, and he has, super ultra mind powers and kind of ends up as a brain, a disembodied brain, because his mind powers are so strong and his body's so messed up that he can exist as a brain. So that's the book. It really resonated with me as a child. I read it again and I enjoyed it because nostalgia is a wonderful thing that is an extremely powerful force at times. And I was sick, so wanted something easy, something that could go down well, like a cheeseburger. Couldn't eat a fancy meal at this stage. So that was that one. The next one is, that's the third one. This is the next one, Diamond Mask. So this is a little bit further in time, 10 or so years, and it tells the story of the person who would become Jack the Bodiless's wife, and her name is Diamond Mask, or Dorothy. Never really liked this one back then, and honestly, if I'm being truthful to me and to you, I would say it was because it was entirely around a female character, which as a 14-year-old boy, I was not interested in learning about female characters going through struggles. I was interested in learning about, I guess, Jack the Bodiless going through struggles. So I always had trouble with it. This time around reading it, it was quite enjoyable. She's a very sensitive young girl, Dorothy, very introverted and, I guess, hesitant about the things that life is thrusting upon her. And that's kind of one of the major focuses of the trilogy, is that the galactic milieu basically says, hey, you're this smart, or you have this many brain powers and so forth, therefore you must do this job, irrespective of what you want. So the classic example of someone in the series is a violinist who is forced to become a scientist and who doesn't really want to. So she is forced, because she's very strong in mind powers, pretty much as strong as Jack the Bodiless, who is the strongest in history. She's forced to do things she doesn't necessarily want to do in terms of the government and ruling, and that's her struggle. So this time around, as hopefully much more sensitive person in his 30s, I quite liked it. I think it's a little weak in terms of the story, but I think that's more second book in a trilogy problems rather than being about a female protagonist, because of course that is not in and of itself an inherent problem and shouldn't be. So yeah, Diamond Mask. And then the last one, Magnificat. There we go. So this is where it all comes together, it all falls apart and bad things happen and lots of people die, and it's 500 pages and it's about 200 or 300 pages too short, which you will never hear me say ever about any other book in the history of the world, because I like short books, and I think short books are where it's at, and I think long books are an excuse for an author to be lazy. But this book is too short. It's going along and having a great old time, and then 300 pages into a 500-page book, it realizes, well, Fury's still around, Hydra's still around, and the humans are still having trouble with the galactic milieu, and we got 200 pages left. So everything just happens really fast, and I think that is a bit of a mistake. So maybe another book would have helped, or maybe a bigger book would have helped. It wraps it up nicely, but too quickly. Far, far, far too quickly. So all of the terrible machinations that occur, just page after page of extreme plot. Anyway, so that's that trilogy. Gillian May, incidentally, because I hadn't thought about her in 10 years, a long time. She died last year, and that is sad, but people do die, so there will be no more stories about Jack the Bodiless, I suppose. I didn't really expect there would be. These books were published in the 90s, I think, so she was done and dusted with it, but there you go, dead. So, next one. I am going to butcher this person's name, and I am very apologetic towards it. Muharrem Bazdoul. I'm giving it my best shot, guys. I don't really know. This book is called Transit, Comet, Eclipse. It has 3 stories, Transit and Comet and Eclipse, and it is incredible. So this is from the Delphi Archive Press. I read it twice this year. It's very short. It's 100 or so pages. It is by a Bosnian writer, I believe. No, it is not. He was born in Yugoslavia. There you go. So he's stateless, I suppose. It deals with various bits and pieces, but I won't go into too much about that because the story I want to talk about the most is Comet. Comet was a horrific read. It is about a young girl who falls in love with a very charming and sophisticated young man. She's a schoolgirl. I think she's in the last year of school. And stars in her eyes, can't believe how handsome he is, can't believe how charismatic and charming he is, and just falls. And as I was reading it, I was expecting, he would want her for sex or whatever, and it never went that way, at least at the start. So he's all very much, you don't really want to be with me, I'm a bit older than you, just finish school, do what you need to do, be with a boy your own age, and she's just going on and on about it. And, pushing him, and he's like, well, all right, I'll give you a little bit of a kiss, and well, all right, we'll have a little bit of a date, but, you need to be with people of your own age, and, you're reading the story and you're expecting something bad to happen, the anticipation and the dread is building and building, but the male character just diffuses that, it just goes away. It's like, okay, this is a different kind of story, something else is going to happen here, that's fine, not sure what, but that's okay. And then, boy, does it get bad. So, she basically ends up being trafficked to a different country and sold as a sex slave, and it's horrific, and it takes a little while to realize what's actually going on because it stays very, very good and safe, I suppose. Like, she goes to the other country and he takes her out to a nice dinner and they have a glass of wine and he says, I love you, and she says, I love you. It's all very sweet and nice. And we're really lulled into this idea that, okay, this is just a story of two people who fall in love. He's a bit older, she's a bit younger, well, whatever. All that dread that I had before was just me, putting my own spin on it, my own preferences, my own prejudices, all that sort of thing. But no, it is terrible. And when the girl finally realizes, and of course she realizes after us, but not much after us, it's pretty brutal, and it's quite gut-wrenching, and it is a story that has stayed with me for a while. So that's why I read it again, because it was really impactful. The other two stories are good. They're about Eastern European people having adventures. They're good, but the middle story, Comet, is tremendous, and it is worth buying this book for that alone. Okay, second book I read for the month, because we are going backwards through things, because this is a strange way of doing it, I suppose, is Jorge Luis Borges' Dr. Brody's Report. So my sister's name is Brody, which has nothing to do with this book, but I always think about it when I read it. She's not a skeleton. She's very thin, but she's not a skeleton. And I don't really like this book. I love Borges, and I think that everyone should read him all the time and as much as possible. I go through phases where I read one of his short stories a day. I've got a big, nice, thick collection of all of his short stories, and I'll just do that until it's done. And whenever I do that, it is a wonderful experience, and I wish everyone would do it at least once. But for some reason, the stories in this one, they don't cohere for me as much as some of his other collections. I see what he's doing, and it's good, and it's Borges, and that's fine, but doesn't quite. It feels like someone else is writing a Borges story at times. And incidentally, he does talk about that in his introduction, that, he's at a stage of his life where he can just bash out a Borges story, so he does. And, maybe if you're aware of that, you shouldn't do it. I don't know. So this one, for me, is not a place to start with Borges at all. And maybe the skeleton will steer you away, I don't know. The best place to start is with his fictions, or fictions it's sometimes called, because it is his masterpiece. It is amazing, it's revolutionary, changed literature, unbelievable, etc, etc, etc. Everything you've heard about it is true. Okay, and then the final book, or really the first book I read for the month, is Felicity Castagna, No More Boats. So this is an Australian writer, and the publisher is Giramondo, which is a small Australian press. I thought this book had a really strong first 2 pages, a strong first 30 pages, and then the rest of it was quite weak. I felt like I was watching an episode of Neighbours, which, if you are from Australia, you will know what that means. I felt like I was watching a soap opera, but not with much drama in terms of the quality. It really fell off a cliff. It really, really fell off a cliff. It started very strong. I was like, okay, cool. Australian writer, new-ish writer. She's had a couple of books published. She's a female writer, so it's a different voice to my own. So this is all very interesting. It's about immigration. It's about boat people issues. So Australia has problems with being racist, like a lot of other countries, and we direct our racism towards people who arrive on boats, because if you arrive on a boat, apparently you are worse than someone who arrives on a plane. I don't know. Figure it out, white Australia. But it's not a very good book. It doesn't do much with what it's trying to do. It doesn't go anywhere interesting. It's not written particularly well. The storylines don't interlock as much as they should, so we learn a lot about things we just don't need to care about. And it was a bit of a disappointment. So that's a real shame. This book is shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award, which is one of our premier awards, and that is also a shame because I bought all of them and now I'm disappointed based on this one. I'm like, well, I don't really want to read the rest, do I? If this one is bad. So those are the books I've read. From some statistics, because statistics are always fun, I've written those down. 4 females and 4 males, 50%. That's pretty good. No real... I wasn't really trying to do anything there. It just kind of happened that way. So I'm doing my best to read female writers at the moment, and I got 50%. So, good for me, I suppose. Translated fiction, 4 out of 8, 50%. That's also good. Interestingly, 3 of the 4 were Spanish language initially, which does not surprise me because I deeply feel affection towards the Spanish language and Spanish language writers. And then reread. So I've read 7 of these books before. 7, which is quite striking. I'm in obviously a bit of a reread phase at the moment. I think if I was to look at the previous month, it'd be pretty similar. I think that's bad in a way. I think I need to be reading more fresh books to hear voices I haven't heard and experiences I haven't had, and maybe I'll discover a writer who means more to me than anyone else ever has, and I can't do that by rereading. I can only do that by reading new books. And 3 of the 8 were from small presses, and I try and read small presses as well because generally speaking they're doing interesting things. They may not always succeed. So for example, No More Boats by Felicity Castaña to me wasn't a success, but it's a small publisher, they're taking a risk on something. Good. The other one was Dalkey Archive Press for this one, which was great. And then if I can rustle it up on my pile, Cesar Ira's The Literary Conference, which is from New Directions. And as mentioned, I did a video about this, and I think it is a tremendous book that everyone should read. And it's extremely short. It's 90 pages. You can read it in a day. Afternoon. You can read it on the bus. I don't know. Depends where you're going on the bus. So that's me for July. August, it is Women in Translation Month. So there is a wonderful Twitter account called Women in Translation, and it is all about focusing on reading women in translation because translated fiction is a small part of all the fiction published, and women in translation is a smaller part of that. So there aren't many around compared to what you might find in the English language. So having a month devoted to reading that kind of fiction is a good way of raising awareness, talking about writers you might not normally talk about, getting involved with genres and time periods and etc. that you may not be familiar with or comfortable with. So for me, I'm going to do my best to read as many female writers as possible. I've got a pile which is right there, which is impossible for anyone to see, but it's about 20 books, and I will not read all of those. I would like to. We'll see how we go. But it's 20 books that I've picked out from my various bookshelves as a way of saying, look, these are the ones I'm going to read, or at least try to read, and I'm pretty excited about it because I would say I've read maybe a third of those books. So there's a lot of new voices there, a lot of new writers that I have heard about but haven't yet read myself. So if anyone is interested, I will include a Twitter link to the user who looks after all that and include the hashtags. And I strongly recommend that if you're interested in translated fiction, if you're interested in female writers, this is a great month to do it, this being August, because everyone else is doing it, everyone else is talking about it. And on that note, I will bid everyone farewell and thank you for watching.